Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back for day 3 of BioC 2026. I'm going to say a couple of things. One, take a look at the Zulip. I added a new conversation related to a repo for activities we can do during the day. It's still somewhat underspecified. I'm going to put some more stuff on it soon, but we want to have a good, productive couple of sessions today. And they can be related to development, they can be related to strategy, they can be related to user concerns that are not met. So I encourage you to take a look at the repo, file some issues, maybe clone it, fork it, what have you. Make a pull request. It's a real pleasure to introduce Mike Lawrence, who has been integral to the Bioconductor project for many years. I was gratified to put Mike and others on the spot when we were getting cake the other day, and to hear the comments about what it was like back in the day when Pat and Mark and Hervé and Michael were all working together on Bioconductor with Rob Gentleman, Martin Morgan, probably a number of other folks that I'm not mentioning. The thing was really boiling, and the effects of that are echoing to this day. Many of the things that they created are still in wide, rapid use. And what Michael's going to talk to us today about is an evolution. So the methods package is a creation mainly of John Chambers, who is the creator of S, or one of the creators of S, right? Going back in history, I think is important because, and I made a blog post on this, a lot of what we're talking about was actually doable in 1984 with S. You had things like vignettes through something called S Report. You'd have different utilities and so on. It wasn't quite as beautiful, but a lot of the ideas of integrated data science reporting were available quite some time ago. So the idea that the methods package came about right around the time that we started Bioconductor is kind of interesting. And I think one of the reasons we committed to it was that, it had this formal character going beyond S3, so that the components were very carefully, formally specified, and the classes of the components were all well defined. The other thing that I was most interested in was validation, so that you could actually define a method that said whether an object was valid or not. So those are all great things, but the methods package is a pretty complicated business, and Mike has done the service of maintaining it for a number of years. I think the methods package and the S4 class concept reach to a principle that Rob Gentleman continually articulates to me about how we should evolve the project and how we do genomic data science. It's that we really need data structures that people can program to in whatever language they may need or be interested in, but we need structures that have well-defined behaviors, guaranteed behaviors, and S4 met that need for us to this date. I wanted to bring out one last concept in connection with this. There's this concept in machine learning that was popularized by David Donahoe. He used the term frictionless reproducibility. And his claim was that the existence of data and code and then leaderboards is what drove machine learning to the rapid acceleration of success that it's seen to date. Frictionless reproducibility. I talked to Tim Treesh about it a little bit over breakfast. Frictionless is wrong, and reproducibility is probably not right either. It's not achieved, and there's friction, and the friction is actually a good thing. That's how you learn to generate heat, find errors, and so forth. And in reflecting on this, Rob Gentleman and Tony Rossini and I wrote an obituary for Fritz Leisch. Fritz Leisch was the creator of SWeave. I think it might be in the R journal. I don't know exactly where it turned out. But we raised the term low friction extensibility. So the idea is that the success is not when you have something that's perfectly reproducible. The success is where it's concrete enough that you can actually make it better. That's what we are looking for when we say we have open source software and we have an open source ecosystem, not so that you can just use it for free, but so that you can actually make it better. And this is one of the things that's going on with S7, and I invite Mike to give us a talk about it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Vince, for the kind and really insightful introduction. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about S7. So a little bit of a story first. My son, he goes to college. I guess he took a computer science class somewhere, and he came home and he said, "Dad, why do you work on R? It isn't even object oriented." And I kind of meekly replied, "Well, it has object oriented features." Uh, and I'm going to talk about one of those features, a number of those different features today. So, go from running. So S7 came about through a collaboration among a lot of different groups, even some groups that haven't historically worked together as much as they could have. The intent here was to really make this something that could emerge as a community-wide standard, with everybody kind of having their hand in the pie there and an investment in it. So the most of the work actually was done by Hadley and Tomasz at Posit. And then we in our core also gave a lot of advice, and then we also had participation from, say, our OpenSci and even Jan Vitek and some of his students weighed in from the computer science side of things and try to make sure we weren't doing too many crazy things with non-standard evaluation and all of that. So, all right. So I'm just going to go through this outline. Why does Bioconductor need OOP? How R currently supports that? What we learned from S4 and how S7 might solve some of the problems that we identified, and then talk about some more recent work around starting to experiment with porting some Bioconductor infrastructure over to S7. All right, so why does Bioconductor need OOP? So Bioconductor is a shared software ecosystem, right? It's a project that aims to achieve interoperability between thousands of packages, over 25 years of accumulated code, objects shared across many packages, and new experiments, being developed all the time, right? So it's not a CRAN for biology, right? We have a repository to distribute the software that we make together, right? But we make it with a shared purpose. And one of the main purposes is that interoperability, right? So these packages have to understand objects from one another, be robust to changes in the implementation of those objects and packages. They want to share the same interfaces so that users aren't totally confused by inconsistencies across packages. These objects must ensure that they're valid, even as they're being manipulated by code written by different people across time and space. And you always want to be able to extend these objects to new science. So just to kind of make the case, if you imagine that somebody's experiment didn't exist, right? So a researcher still has this problem. They've got some RNA-seq data. They got their rows or genes or columns or samples. Their immediate goal is differential expression. And they've got two data frames of metadata and account matrix. Right, so they have these three aligned views, but they don't have this container, right? Let's imagine that they don't have ESET either, right? They don't have anything like this, right? So the first kind of problem that you start to notice is you're juggling like three different objects that are all supposed to be coordinated, right? So you're passing those to your maybe GalaFit model function, a plot top genes function. This is hard to read, it's tedious, it's error prone to deal with these objects. You'll do things like this, where you might decide to keep the genes with, I don't know, a count above 10, and then you want to subset, but you subset the counts, but you forget to subset your genes, or you get them in the wrong order, or whatever it might be, and then bugs can happen, right? Sometimes silent bugs even, which are worse. Then you might say, well, maybe to make that a little bit easier, I'll put stuff into a list, so they're all part of the same list, so I can pass them around together. It's a little bit safer. It doesn't solve all the problems. You might say, well, I still want to be able to subset this object, this list, but I can't because I don't have I don't have any semantics on this list, just a plain list, right? It doesn't know what to do. And so then you might go to S3, and so you add an RNA-seq class onto your experiment object, your list. You define a dim method for it, and now some of these things start to work. But that list with an S3 class attached to it, that label attached to it, doesn't really mean a whole lot. So you might have some old code that's passing in some, it's constructing the list with an old set of names, and it still inherits from your class, but it's not really a valid object, right? So if you pass it to your new code, you've named the gene data has been named feature data instead of row data, for example, and things are wrong. So you need a contract, right? That's what a class is really a contract of how your data are supposed to be represented. And in Bioconductor, we rely on this for distributed coordination. So these objects have this explicit validated structure. They have common operations that we define on them that have consistent meaning. Implementations are hidden behind an API. And this class then serves as a contract between packages. So these packages can all align on the classes. They can define new data types based on those as they extend Bioconductor, and the users are protected. So I guess the question is, so obviously, BioC heavily depends on OOP. But how we have to, I think it's beholden us to continue to think about, given that we're one of the primary drivers of the use of S4, we should continue to think about, how should this evolve? All right, so in order to do that, I think we should take a little step back and think, generally about how R supports OOP. And so I guess the first thing to kind of come back to first principles, is that R is designed for data science, right? It's not really a general purpose programming language. It's been designed for a purpose. And here you have this book by Wickham et al., R for Data Science. They lay out this sort of paradigm. They formalize this, and you can see that here in this sort of layout of how you would go about data science, your edges here are objects being passed between different steps of your analysis, and your nodes are functions that are operating on those objects. And then you can kind of connect this to a very different kind of book by John Chambers, his most recent book around extending R, where he lays out 4 principles. Everything in R is an object. Everything that happens is a function call. R is an interface to other languages and systems. And now we'd even kind of layer that on. It's really a user interface, really designed around the needs of the user. And that R is designed to be extensible from the ground up, right? And so you can think of now R as an extensible, functional, object-oriented user interface is effectively what it is, right? And so when we say R is object-oriented, what do we mean? So I think fundamentally it comes down to things like this. We can have a print function. I mean, whenever you type something at the console, you evaluate it, and something is printed out, right, to the console. It's calling this print function, and this print function is what we call a generic function because it will dispatch to a method depending on the type of object. And this is something in computer science, when you write one piece of code and it can operate differently on different types of objects, that's called polymorphism. And so this allows, in R's case, to make a convenient user interface because the user only has to think, I want to print this thing. And it doesn't matter if it's a data frame or if it's a date time object, you're going to get the right type of display. And so that's key to R's user interface. And the way that it does this is by something called dynamic dispatch. So it looks at the class and then dispatches to different code depending on the class, right? And that those two properties, like polymorphism and dynamic dispatch, are, as far as I can tell, present in every object-oriented language. So you can, you don't actually need formal class definitions, you don't need inheritance, but you need this ability to have an object and to be able to treat that object differently based on some type. And I guess the thing is that, step back a little bit further in time, these early OOP languages, they actually focused on this message passing and encapsulation paradigm. So the canonical example, and actually the example that drove the development of early OOP, was this thing called the model view controller. And so this is something that a design pattern that has persisted across many decades of computer science, sits underneath like all of the graphical user interfaces that we use today. And this is the idea where you have three different modules. You have your model, your underlying data model. You have the view of that model. And then you have a way to control the user, for example, or some other client, to be able to control and make changes to the model. And those changes to the model then propagate to the view. And in this paradigm, these different objects are talking to each other. And sort of simultaneous with the MVC was developed a language called Smalltalk. And so that's it name directly refers to what they were trying to achieve here as they were working on inventing. This all happened at Xerox PARC, by a group led by Alan Keyes, where they were basically inventing the modern GUI, right? This window icon menu pointer WIMP interface, where you have your underlying file system might be your data model. You have a view of that file system, and you have a way through your pointer to control and to make changes to the underlying model. All right, and there are several defining characteristics of this approach, and by the way, this approach underlies almost every modern object-oriented language, from Java, C++, Python, Rust. Your objects are acting like stateful agents. They send messages to each other that update that mutable state. That state is encapsulated so that they can emit changes to that state, propagate changes so that other objects are then updated, and these systems can function. And there's a pretty big difference between that and what Common Lisp back in the early 80s invented, when they said, okay, we're a functional language, so we're primarily based around these first-class functions, and now we sort of want to adapt these OOP ideas to and polymorphism, et cetera, to our functional programming. And so the Common Lisp object system said, well, let's take what is currently this, there's this coupling of the state to the behavior, and there's single dispatch where code is depending only on what object is receiving that message. And instead, let's separate out these orthogonal concerns into a function that represents the behavior and an object that represents the state. And now what happens is you pass these objects to a function, and you can have functions that where different functions are invoked based on not only a single argument, but multiple arguments, whatever you pass to that function, right? You can have different behaviors happen. All right, so functional OP is really interesting because it makes it a lot easier to extend system behavior, which is something that's always been a quality of Lisp, but also very important for things like R. So if you imagine you had a framework in which you were going to encode different ways of writing out objects to different file formats. You could have in your message passing system, you might define a class CSV writer, define, it knows what separator it wants to use, say comma or semicolon, and then it also has the behavior. It has the method to write, say, a data frame object out. But in your functional OP system, now this is written in Common Lisp, so sorry for all the parentheses, but the idea is the same. So you define your class, but now you've separated out the state, from the behavior, right? So now you've got a method on a write generic that is going to be mapping a data frame to a CSV format object. So in other words, like when it receives the data frame and it receives the format that you want to write it to, it knows the code knows what it has to do, right? It's going to call, say, read.csv in R, right? Sorry, write.csv in R. And so this this approach makes it really easy for, say, other packages to add new types of writing out different types of objects, different formats. If you imagine if you try to do that in the message passing system, you could define a new writer class, say I don't know, a YAML writer or JSON writer or something like that. But if you wanted to add new methods, if you want to support new data types, say like a matrix, to write to CSV, you couldn't do that in most of these languages, right? Because you'd have to somehow add a method to the existing class. But once you distinguish these, once you decouple these two things, it's easy for people to just define new methods in the write generic, and so it's a much more extensible system. It's also, I think, in many ways, like more natural for data transformations, because you can, in this example of write, as you're defining this list of write methods, you're laying out sort of your mappings, your rules for how you're going to map this data type to another representation, right? And so you can have these sort of transformation rules that you can define. I also kind of wanted to do a quick distinction here, because it often comes up that people say like, well, why can't this work like Julia, where we can pass whatever arguments we want to the function of the same name. So I wanted to kind of distinguish that this generic approach from method overloading, which is where you have methods that have the same name, but they have different signatures, arbitrary signatures, and the compiler figures this out. But in a generic approach, right, there is a generic function with a defined set of arguments, and you're just defining new implementations based on that skeleton. All right. All right. So S3 came along, and it borrowed from class. So you can kind of see the correspondence here. So when you were defining a print generic in class, you can do the same thing with S3, like by using the use method call. You can define methods in a similar way. But of course, it's a little bit ad hoc, right? You've now got this sort of naming convention based way to register methods, and you don't actually have any formal class definitions, right? You have a class label that is defining your class hierarchy at the instance level. So it's this instance level OOP, and it's fairly ad hoc. And so S4 came along, and it again borrowed from class. So, and really via something called a language called Dylan, which is kind of an obscure thing lost to the fossil record of. It was a language developed for the Apple Newton PDA back in the 90s. But the fundamentals of this came from class. And so this idea of so S4 said, okay, we can do a little bit more than S3 did. We can have these now reified classes, right? We can have formal class definitions where we can state our contract. So in this case, we have a ranges class. We now can say our starting with vectors, our numeric vectors, let's say, or integer vectors. And these classes can have defined validity checks. They're self-documenting, and they can define inheritance hierarchies. And so this is a lot better than we were with S3. All right, so what kind of problems then is S7 addressing? So the first thing is, and it's fairly fundamental, even though it seems subtle, it's that S4 objects are not actually S3 objects. And the reason for that is that they have a completely different contract fundamentally in terms of how they represent or what they return from their class, when you call class on them. So this is just kind of demonstrating that if you define a S4 class that is, let's say, an extension of an S3 class, POSIX CT, and you instantiate that, you look at its class, well, it's just the S4 underscore POSIX-CT. It's just the name of the class. Whereas if you asked the return value from sys.time, which is a POSIX-CT object of its class vector, it shows you the whole linearized class hierarchy of the object. And so that's a somewhat fundamental thing, but it means that you can't treat these two object types the same anymore, right? Your code is not going to be polymorphic over S3 and S4 objects. The other thing is that S4 took a bit too much from class, in my opinion, in the sense that class had this idea of these side effects where and this is very common in Lisp. If you guys have used like Emacs or eLisp, it's very good at mutating the system to change how things are functioning. Which is something that maybe is very useful and like when you're trying to customize a text editor, but maybe less useful when you're in a data science language. But it had these same ideas where you would say set generic or set method, and there would be a side effect where some registry somewhere, hidden somewhere, would be updated based on the keys that you give it. And that actually was kind of a divergence from the S3 case, which was simply just the only side effect that S3 had were the assignments in the environment, right? And so it became like less idiomatic by doing that. And the other thing I'm going to introduce here is this idea of an object-oriented user interface. So this is like a formal term that was developed, by the Smalltalk team. They've written books on this subject. Where the whole idea of this WIMP GUI was that the user is manipulating objects, and so these objects are objects in the code, but the user also sees them as objects, and so there's this alignment. Like an alternative would be like a command-oriented user interface, like the Unix shell, where you start thinking about, okay, what command do I want to call, and then you pass in the objects that you want to work on with that command. And so those are two different ways of kind of thinking about the world, two different ways of designing an interface, but you can convert between them. So you can imagine, taking a command-oriented shell and turning it more into an object-oriented shell, where you're doing things on objects. And I think that S4 could benefit from having a more object-oriented user interface in the sense that you could take an S4 object and pull things out of it, treat it as something you can manipulate, like a real world object. And you can do that, say, with the at sign, right? You can pull out different slots from the object. So you can do, say, r at start and get out the starts of your ranges. But if you try to do r at end, because that's not one of the slots, because we're representing ranges of starts and widths, that's not going to work. And then you have the problem where rightfully developers want to be able to hide that representation from the users. They have flexibility to change it. But the problem is, ultimately, is that the user is not directly manipulating the object anymore. You have this sort of abstraction layer in between, where you have to go and find a function to call on the object in order to do anything with it. And that can be a problem. In terms of discoverability, let's say, like it's always been hard for people to find the functions that they can call on an object and things like that. So that's one issue. The other issue is that S4 dispatch is complicated. So this multiple dispatch that S4 implements is really kind of the proper, generally correct thing to do, probably. It computes this sort of Euclidean distance between the arguments that you pass in and the method definitions, and it tries to find the closest one. The problem is it's hard for programmers to think in Euclidean distance when writing their code, and you have these issues. For example, you say, I want to allow merging of data frames and tibbles, right? So tibble derives from data frame, but you want to, in this case, you want to say, every time I merge something that involves a tibble, I want a tibble back. This is just a pattern that comes up a lot. You'll define like a data frame for X, tibble for Y, or the inverse, tibble for X, data frame for Y, and then say, okay, I've covered all the bases, and then made sure that I'm always getting back the result as tibble. I don't know why that says call super in there. It should be call next method. I'll just blame an AI on that one. So, so anyway, when you call merge on two tibbles, you get back an ambiguous result. And so that is why this is happening. That's why this is kind of complicated and hard for users to understand, because now you have to go and define a tibble method, and it just becomes sort of verbose. So how does S7 solve some of these problems? So just kind of summarize. So one of the issues, the S4 objects are not S3 objects, so that makes compatibility harder. S4 could be more idiomatic with fewer side effects. S4 objects would feel more like objects, more like data. And S4 dispatch is complex. So we solve some of these problems by just building on top of S3, right? So S7 objects are S3 objects. S7 is more R-like in its syntax, more idiomatic, has fewer side effects. The properties are encapsulated so that developers have more freedom in terms of exposing convenient properties for users to interact with. And then S7 facilitates reasoning by simplifying simplifying a lot of this. All right, so how does this look? So here we see that here we're defining that same ranges class, but now we're using S7 on the right. And so all we're doing is just constructing. We're no longer like setting a class somewhere in a side effect. We're just constructing a class object and then assigning it to a variable in our environment, right? So that's it's object-oriented programming in that sense. And we have the same thing going on with generics. You construct a generic and assign it to a value. And finally, methods are used as convenient gets syntax where you can set a function as registered as, say, the end method for the ranges class. All right, so properties, these properties that we support, they look a lot like S4 slots, but they're more advanced, and they support this object-oriented user interface idea by encapsulating the underlying representation. So we can do stuff like this. For example, you can define getter and setter methods on these properties. So properties are objects in themselves. When you pass just a type, it conveniently constructs a property for you behind the scenes as a shortcut. But you can create your own property objects with getters and setters, and in this case, we're dynamically computing the end property from the starts and the widths. All right, and so that makes now we construct our ranges object. Now we can do R at end, and we can get back the width, the ends, even though that's not actually a slot in one of our objects. All right. All right. Yeah. They're not reserved. Getter is just an argument to the new property function, and self is an argument that the function takes. Yeah. So. All right. Okay. So now S7 now facilitates reasoning on dispatch as well. It kind of restricts what you can do with dispatch, but probably in a way that's still very useful. And so this is an example of how we would represent this merge problem that I introduced previously, where we don't need to define a tibble method because what happens is a dispatch is hierarchical. So what it'll do is it'll dispatch first in the first argument, and then within that first argument, it then will look for methods that are compatible for the second argument. And since tibble extends data frame, it'll find the x tibble y data frame method even when you pass two tibbles in, and that sort of hierarchical or nested dispatch is something that at least easier for me to read to reason on. Yeah. Well, it's assumed to be defined. Yeah. Why? No, no, it's not. Yeah, no, no, no. That's something. So if you want to define that, right, since Tybalt's an S3 class, you would there's a way with S7 to like uplift just as there is with like S4 to uplift an S3 class to an S7 class. Yeah. Uh, yeah. This was just a sketch. Um, and one thing to notice here too, though, is how we handle the call next method. So what we do actually is you call super on an object that you want to upcast. And it's a special kind of upcast that ensures that the next method is selected for that thing. So it makes it a lot less ambiguous about what's going to happen when you call next method. There's no sort of non-standard evaluation where it's like looking up into the frame to figure out what you're doing. Instead, you're saying, look, I want to treat this object X as if it were just a data frame, not a Tibble, and that was something that actually came directly from like Jan Vitek's group when they were like so tired of all the non-standard evaluation being difficult to compile. So this is very explicit, but it's easier to read, I think, for people to understand what's going on, and easier for compilers to compile. That's one difference. All right, and S4 actually S7 is supported from the very beginning a lot of compatibility with S4. So we allow you to call get class on the object on the class, right? And you get back this class representation object, which you can then use in pretty much anywhere you can use an S7 class. So you could even take an S4 generic and use the method get syntax with this S4 class, and you'd be defining an S4 method behind the scenes. Or you can take an S3 generic even, or of course an S7 generic, and use this S4 class for dispatch. That's worked for a long time, and you could also use that type for properties, for property types. But what's new actually this summer is that I went off and did a lot of work to now allow you to even extend S4 classes with S7 classes. And so that brings compatibility to another level. And the way this works, it's not too magical. It just uses the set old class, and so our objects are just S3 objects. We can largely rely on the set old class bridge to make a lot of this happen. So the S4 underscore register call really just calls set old class. Now, though, it even will call, it'll use this obscure S4 class argument to the set old class function, which allows you to pass in basically a dummy S4 class that has slots that represent the structure of your S3 object. This is a feature that's always existed for a long time in the methods package. But now you can, when you register your S7 class, it'll now tell S4 that your object has these slots that are actually properties in S7. And so that's a nice feature. And now also we can call S4 contains, which actually doesn't do a whole lot, but it's there as sort of a abstraction right now. But it'll in principle will now allow you to use S4 classes to extend S7 classes. So you can pass in the result of S4 contains to the contains argument to set class, and so now you can extend in both directions. And so that's what led me to consider how we might do this in summarized experiment. And so the idea here, thinking about, okay, if we're going to start to allow people to experiment with S7 and Bioconductor, what kind of concerns are there around compatibility and interoperability? So, and the hardest thing I could think of to try would be to re-implement summarized experiment in S7, and then still keep everything above it, all the infrastructure above it the same in S4, and all the stuff that's based on it, like single cell experiment, still in S4, and not change any of those, not change the parents or the children, and have this work. So really just kind of ripping out the guts of like the heart of Bioconductor, changing it to S7, like a transplant, and then have it still work. And indeed, it was successful. It just took a couple weeks of like wrestling with codecs to convince it to do this the right way. Yeah, so what we've done now is we now can call new, and this is code in a fork of Samara's experiment, it defines now Samara's experiment as an S7 class, and there's a little bit of a trick here with rectangular vectors, a S4 class I defined that handles the multiple inheritance, because S7 only supports single inheritance. So on purpose, it's a lot simpler. We bring together now the vector class and rectangular data class through multiple inheritance into a single S4 class called rectangular vector, and then use that as the parent for Samara's experiment. So we kind of get our way around the multiple inheritance that way. And then the other subtle thing here is that because we're defining Samara's experiment now as an object, right? And in S7, right, that class object is your constructor, just as Samara's experiment is currently a constructor for an S4 class. But we have to have it maintain the same contract as Samara's experiment constructor has always had for all the code to continue working. So you can define a custom constructor to do that. And then you can pass down actually the same exact validity function is used for validating the object, which is kind of interesting. You just have to adapt it here because the formals go from self to object anyway. So we're going to, of course, call S4 register on our summarized experiment object so it can be used with S4 stuff. That calls set old class behind the scenes. But what we'll also do is call S4 contains, because what we need to do, right, if downstream code is continuing to work, we still need an S4 class called summarized experiment. So we call set class summarized experiment, and we have it contain the S7 class, right? So we've just defined a proxy subclass off of our S7 implementation to make that work. And then another, I called it a hack, but then I asked ChatGPT to review my slides, and it's actually called a compatibility boundary. Whatever that means. But what the trick here is that we actually return, when you call summarized experiment, we return the S4 object by default, not the S7 object. So it's an S4 object, but it's implemented using an S7 class. So anyway, just the subtleties there. And all that means, by the way, is that because in S7, when we built S7, we actually made some changes to BaseR to enable all such systems, where we now have a common object type, fundamental type, and at the C layer in R, right? So it went from the S4 SXP to the OBJ SXP. But the only difference between now for an S4 object is that it has the S4 bit, which it's always had, set on that OBJ SXP. So it's really just a difference of a bit being set, but it has a lot of consequences. But anyway, so the S7 syntax is used for all method registrations, whether it's an S3 internal generic, an S4 generic. We preserve inheritance for range summarized experiments. So range summarized experiment is also an S7 class. But in order to get it to obey both hierarchies, we use multiple inheritance for the S4 class, where we pass in our S7 range summarized experiment and our S4 summarized experiment. And then the whole goal here was to get it so the single cell experiment passes all of its tests. It's a very well tested package that makes deep use of summarized experiment. And so the goal was to make that pass tests. And that was achieved, and there were no changes to single cell experiment. So compatibility boundary worked. And then, yeah, so now we have the ability to define our foundational classes in S7 once, do a few tricks to preserve S4 downstream compatibility, and then allow downstream packages to migrate over time. And so that was the goal, and it seems to work in this one isolated case. I'm kind of scared to try it, and I'm sure more things will come up, but I think we can resolve them. And so anyway, there's this migration branch you can check out, and the S7 compatibility guide. I guess I'll put these slides somewhere where people can get them on Zulip. Yeah, so that's my talk, and yeah, got time for questions. Questions? I don't know what happened to Vince, but yeah.
Does S7 support virtual classes with no slots?
Yeah. We call them abstract classes, but yeah. Yep. Yeah. We're in questions now. Yeah.
Does CLJ has an S4 bit? How is
You should use the mic.
are other future classes gonna need that kind of thing? All right, thank you. If the underlying C object has an S4 bit, are future classes going to need a similar recognition bit in the underlying C object?
No. So we didn't want to change, S4 really at all, right? So we allowed it to continue using its bit. But the idea is that more or less these classes would depend on S3 and internal dispatch in order to handle their object types. So we added a number of different hooks. For example, like inherits, so that inherits will work on whatever new object type you define. There are now hooks for that to work, but they do dispatch at the S3 level for that to happen. Yeah. Up there? Yeah.
So in microbiome research, we use the tree summarized experiment, which is the summarized experiment with a tree. And then there is this spatial experiment with some spatial coordinates to this summarized experiment. And we would want to use the methods. There is this thing called spatial microbiome stuff, what they are studying. So is it easy to merge these classes to do spatial tree summarized experiment?
Is it easy to merge the?
Yes, so merge these two different classes into one, so that those methods that are developed for spatial experiment is also usable for this tree summarized experiment.
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I would recommend doing that is through probably through some type of composition, right? So you have your spatial experiment data, and you have your microbiome data, or the data, the tree summarized experiment, right? Maybe try to have those two things somehow composed, because yeah, the other alternative being multiple inheritance, which is not supported by S7. So I would think about your design, how you might use composition to achieve that. Anyway, that's a big thing, but that's not a simple thing to do. But we can talk about that offline.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Great talk. I was wondering, how much of this is on CRAN versus what's on Bioconductor, and do you have recommendations for how to making that clear when you're developing software that's more general R purpose?
Yeah. So S7 is on CRAN, right? It's general R infrastructure. I would say anything else that say enhances S7. For example, I recently created a package called 11, because it brings convenience to S7. Um, but anyway, that's going to go on CRAN too, right? It's just sort of the general extension of it. But yeah, obviously anything that isn't currently in Bioconductor should stay in Bioconductor, right? And use S7, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so we have packages like S4 vectors. So there are some other packages in Bioconductor that maybe should be on CRAN.
That's a good point.
Maybe
That's a good point. Yeah.
We should move those to CRAN.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I think it might be worth thinking about that again. We've thought about that for a long time. There's reasons why there are reasons of convenience for keeping it within Bioconductor, right? It sits on top of our own infrastructure and all of that. But it could be more generally useful to people, right? Especially if it's something, the idea behind, as I said, a lot of the idea behind S7 was that the tidyverse and other parts of the R community could really get on board. And if right now there's this VCTRS package vectors, right, from the tidyverse people, and there's the S4 vectors, why don't we just have one vectors package that maybe even eventually could make it into base R for whatever it does, right? But yeah, I hope we could start to, this will allow us to share with other communities more, right? Yeah.
I have a question. Just because of the scale of some of these efforts, like when Python went from version 2 to version 3, like there were branches that were maintained on both, and something of this scale, I'm assuming would require something like that, where it's almost a multi-release rollout, because to try to do an S4 to S7 migration in a single Bioconductor release might be a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that may be what we need. But I did try to make it so we didn't have to do that, right? It's like this attempt here was to say that you could actually keep your package without changes and have it depend on an S7 based package, right? And if we can achieve that, then we might not need too much forking or fragmentation, right? So downstream packages don't have to change, and users, won't really be affected at all, ideally, right? They wouldn't notice any changes in behavior or anything, right? So that's the goal. Now, whether that's actually feasible in practice or not, because I've only done this in an isolated case, I'm not sure, right? And it's been proposed that we actually employ AI to make that easier. So if we do have to do it like in one fell swoop, that we can somehow orchestrate it that way. But there's a lot of gotchas with that, obviously. Right.
I think to continue on Marcel's question, you have now an implementation of a definition of summarized experiment. Would we think about removing the definition that's currently S4 based and sliding in yours?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
And then test that on the develop branch.
I'm sure there'd be a lot of failures. But so if there would be a way, if there was a way that we could do that without actually slotting it in, like if we could like slot it in, but only like a build system sees it, that would be convenient. And then I could like iterate towards getting them all to work again. But just doing it, I think at this point is probably a little bit too risky. It'd be too much breakage.
And that's because of code that sort of goes outside of the expected API?
There's a lot of reasons, but mostly reasons that I haven't anticipated, right? I know there's just stuff I haven't thought of, because every time, I don't know, there were so many things that came up when trying to get single cell experiment to work that I know, even though single cell experiment's a pretty complicated package, it's sort of like the law of CRAN, right? Like there's always going to be some CRAN package that does some crazy thing that you never expected. As an R core member, like that always gets us. And I'm sure it's going to happen again for Bioconductor, right? These are just two fundamental classes.
I think, we have the opportunity to make more experimental environments with not all the ecosystem, but maybe a large number of them. And then we could,
Yeah.
I think it'd be good to set up some teamwork to find out where the things are breaking and
Agreed. Yeah.
see what will
Yeah.
happen.
Maybe the R universe can make this easier. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, folks, if there aren't any more questions, I think we should thank Mike and start a break.